today and couldn't join us. So this is April 22nd, 2022, AKv3. Thank you. Those of you able to join us today, we've got a board meeting scheduled for next week. So this week was just kind of a soft week of just checking in with folks on a few projects that have been percolating. I had sent out a note suggesting a possible discussion around this work by John Hagel that I thought was an interesting lens into the question of why is it important for us to be working on building these opportunity narratives, and his blog post about how the future creates the present. If folks want to dive into that, I'd enjoy that, but I'm also happy to get drug off onto a different bunny trail as we need to. And we'll also take a second to check in on the work from last week with the military innovation ecosystem. So that's kind of the beginnings. If there are other agenda items or anything you want to throw in when we do introductions, just bring them up and we'll go from there. I will try and drop the link for the agenda and the meeting notes. And just as a reminder, I think most of you guys all know this, but this is kind of a running document that's actually kind of interesting to start looking through now, because it's got over a year of these meetings with the notes from them that have been collected. And it's a pretty long document, but you can scan through it and see kind of an interesting record of discussions over a long period of time. So there's that. Sorry, I have a computer that will not use the letter C at the moment, and that's turning out to be a problem. But let's see, if we want to run around, let's see what's going on with folks in terms of anything new this week or any agenda items. Ryan, what's going on with you?
Boy, I'm doing a little bit of time traveling this morning. I just got off the Zoom with a guy named Kevin Hugh, and Kevin is over in Galway, Ireland, and he's been working with a community development organization over there that's been in existence for over 50 years. And when they got started out, by doing a bond raise, and they walked around to community members, they knocked on their door, and they raised about 13,000 Irish pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot until you translate that into today's funding, and that would be about $300,000 that they raised in a single afternoon by going around and knocking on doors. And they use that funding to then build 9 thatched cabins for tourism. And they then took that money and then kept investing it back into the community. And it's a really powerful example of what can be done with a strong network of people who are connected and who are wanting to work together to revitalize the community. They've got a lot of parallels between Alaska with being remote and being told, well, you just can't expect the same sort of reports that you would get if you're in the hub. And so it was a really cool conversation. I'm now scheming and dreaming about how I can potentially go over to Ireland and learn from Kevin, and how we can get him over here to tell the story of his organization that he works with. But it's been a really cool start to the day, cool week, and just excited. But we got to work on that narrative for what we're doing our fundraise for and where we want to go.
Oh, very good, thanks. Andy, what's happening with you today?
Oh, hang on. Not a whole lot, just trying to get wrapped up the end of the semester, and you know how that is. So not really. Actually, also applied to transition over from IBPP to Institute of Health and Wellness in a position there. So who knows? If I don't get that position, I'll stay with IBPP. And it's not like I don't like what I do, but there's a little more responsibility over the other position. It's basically, without being a director position, it's the director of the health, the non-nursing health programs. at APU. So,
Hmm.
and that's actually my background is in allied health.
Mhm.
And, you know, we have had those programs through APU for a few years now with nobody as a point of contact specific with that background. So, but there've been some other applications too. So one of us will be coming in and managing that program. So anyway, I'm kind of ambivalent. I would enjoy it, but at the same
Mhm.
time, I like what I'm doing. So,
Mhm.
you know, it's just a little bit better fit for me at APU, but, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Super. Okay. Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Taylor, what's new with you, and what's exciting as you look ahead?
Hey guys, I and apologies, I'm going to be in and out on this because we've got another call going that I'm listening in on. We are just wrapping up kind of 3 very busy weeks, going from some Arctic focus. Hold on a second, I need that other conversation. We are going from kind of multiple conferences into some discussions with new portfolio companies that we're looking at adding, and then just kind of having a conversation with some fishermen right now about trials that we're going to be running in pollock bee season starting in July. So kind of some exciting stuff. Can't wait to tell you guys more. Unfortunately, working with seafood companies, I'm allowed to say we're doing projects, but I can't say with whom, where, when, really, or what we're doing. But just know that there's some really cool, innovative stuff happening in the Alaska seafood space right now. We also are working with Sail Drone, who we just added last month, trying to help just kind of get some stuff through with NOAA. So we're learning all of the joys of working with the federal government and researchers, and beginning to learn some, like I thought, interesting lessons about kind of later stage government contracting and kind of things you need to anticipate after you have that first success of a contract and deployments. There really is kind of a second valley of death, which is when you are trying to commercialize with industry players and keep your government contracts. It turns out to be really tough, especially when you're working with researchers who are only ever working on that kind of boundary between basic and applied research. So if anyone ever runs into those problems, happy to commiserate together and compare notes. So yeah, that's kind of what we've got going at the moment. Excited for kind of this work. I'm looking forward to hopefully having more time in the next few months to engage, and really looking forward to the board meeting next week.
Great. Thanks for joining us today. And I know that there's many others in Alaska that have struggled with that relationship in contracting with the government on projects, and particularly innovation. And it's actually kind of an interesting area to maybe down the road ponder how to help folks navigate that one. I know Hans at Triveris is in particular, I know navigated that and nearly been killed by that a couple times because of the difficulty and the onerous overhead. There's nothing like dealing with the massive number of FARs and requirements that would otherwise make it impossible if you didn't somehow figure out a way to cut through some of it, or in my case, learn how to cut the right corners and hope that you get away with it. Pasquale, what's new with you, and thoughts on what's ahead?
This week has been, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, this week has been kind of wrapping up a lot of projects, a lot of things. And as always, when you think you have a lot of things coming to a conclusion, then somebody comes with another idea that prevents that from having closure, and it keeps going, and more things keep looking forward for the next board meeting and getting together about to discuss what's the different progress from different sides of the AKv3 that has been moving forward. That's going to be good. And looking also forward to see probably summer is not going to be one of the best times because people are all over the place enjoying summer and these hours of light. But I think the retreat that we had back in Greenwood was a really good one. I really liked the outcome. It was really productive. So I was thinking probably would be a good idea to bring it back to the table to set a date to do something similar. And yeah, I think that would be a good idea. About the what we talked last week, not too much because again this week I have been focused on some other things and not too deep into that arena. I do know that there have been conversations in the background happening, which is good. Even if I'm not involved, I'm pleased that they're happening and they are moving. So that's good. But I don't have anything specific to contribute to that one. And well, that's about it. Yeah.
Super. Thanks, Pascal. Mita and Chris, welcome. What's new?
I don't know that well, everything's new, but and fun and exciting. But it's Friday and it's Earth Day, and I had a really long, awesome week, but kind of tired. So Chris, he just walked out of the room, but he bought that book, the narratives book that you had brought to the King Street Brewery the other day.
Oh,
And we were talking to Ryan about it, and he's like, oh, I want to check that out. So he ordered that and it came in the mail actually really quick. Yeah. So I don't know. I met with Pasquale in person for the first time at his coffee shop. So that was super cool. Ryan and I are kicking around a whole bunch of ideas and building on them. And there's some really cool projects going on at the Heritage Center and Rubber Shack Farm. And I think I'm feeling like I'm stuck in between two seasons because there's snow on the ground and the ground is frozen.
mm-hmm.
And so I want to go outside and I want to do yard work. And I mean, I've found myself outside at this time of year with like pickaxing dirt, trying to get stuff prepped. So I think it's just trying to chill and to let those seeds get planted and that, like percolating for summer. So
Sounds great. Well, I ran off to Portland to escape that in-between season, but I think it's a unique aspect of Alaska that we have such clarity in the four seasons, including these shoulder seasons that are kind of half in, half out. They're neither winter nor summer, or in the case of the fall, they're neither summer nor winter. And I think it's part of the thing that interests me about how do we create a unique culture of work and innovation and community in Alaska that really embraces all four of those communities and the kinds of things you can do in each of those different seasons, including this one that's kind of a little bit of a break from the winter stuff, but we're not quite ready to jump into the summer stuff. So there's kind of a period of time to do some things. I've looked at this period as kind of a time to do some projects that I wouldn't otherwise have time to do. And in this case, running down to Portland to get the truck fixed and drive it back to Alaska. So I'm back in Alaska by the time that this breakup is done. Two things I wanted to just bring up as far as an introduction. One is I did a strategic doing workshop or webinar yesterday. And I'll share the recording when it's out and available. I expect next week, but it was with Ed Morrison, and I thought it was an interesting opportunity to do kind of a little bit of an introduction to strategic doing, but it was really more focused in with practitioners that had a lot more experience with it and some of the questions about sustainability and impact as it relates to agile economic development. But it was a lot of fun, and I continue to be enthused about the opportunity that set us tools that are captured in the strategic doing methodology, but more importantly, the framing that we're using in agile economy views, that four quadrant approach continues to be a increasingly validated and useful way of framing what we do in the future, including one of those quadrants, which is the importance of having an opportunity narrative that we'll come back to in a second. The other thought that I wanted to share is that in reflecting on the work done in the last couple of weeks with the conferences that Taylor was mentioning, which included the Arctic Encounters Conference, the the Infrastructure Symposium, and I didn't attend it, but I think this week was also the Arctic Domain Awareness Center 8th year conference. I'm seeing this interesting opportunity of these spring conferences, as well as what's coming out of the Arctic Innovation Competition and some other activities, as setting the stage for what I think would be even more energy around a fall challenge program of using the springtime period and these kinds of events to capture and curate the challenges that Alaska has, as well as the opportunities, and to be able to bring those into a early fall program that highlights the challenges and tries to incentivize Alaskans to become more engaged in those challenges that matter to our state. And building on the event that we did last fall in September with the challenge pitch event. So I'm continuing to watch that and see that as a really valuable contribution that we can make to the ecosystem to bring visibility to that, but also a role that fits into kind of the cycle of what's going on in Alaska. So I'm hoping to develop that a little bit more in the future. So just two quick updates as far as old business and then move on. The military innovation ecosystem discussion last week, there are notes in the document from that discussion last week. I followed up with Dixie and Joe on that. Dixie and Graham Neuer, I know, have had some discussions. And so it's all kind of jiggling at the moment, but I don't know. I'm not finding critical core mass yet, but I'm going to keep on working on it and see if we can find a core group of folks that wants to take some ownership around the military innovation ecosystem discussion and the opportunities. I continue to be, enthusiastic about the breadth of its impact and value to Alaska. But I also know that it's going to take some focused commitment on a core group of folks to really spend the time to dive into trying to identify all the different pieces of it and to try and build some of the connections, do some of the boundary spanning work across all these different programs. I'm drawn initially to trying to work with the folks who are interested on capturing some sort of state of the military innovation ecosystem and programs just to bring visibility to it. But beyond that, I think the Bunker Labs opportunity is one that will probably develop. So I'll leave that at that for the moment. But I'm curious if anybody else has any other thoughts or follow-up that you've had since last week's discussion on that topic.
No discrete thoughts on it. I see Mita's unmuted, so I'll step out of the way here quickly. But I just wonder what opportunities are there to connect with some of the other accelerators and incubators and things that are there. We've got some things already formed up, and so are there lessons that could be learned? Are there pathways or bridges that could be built? How do we not reinvent the wheel, but maybe we start to form a core of some sort?
Amita?
Yeah, thank you. So Chris is really interested, but this is like his first actual meeting listening in, even though he's heard us speaking for a year and a half, 2 years now. So there's that wanting to get used to the group, the flow, and then maybe getting an idea of like, what does that actually look like? Like, is time commitment process? Is it volunteer? Is there, compensation? Is there funds to do it? Is it all, elbow grease? Like, just like that whole, what is this project? What does it look like and what will it take?
All good questions. I just, spitballing for a moment. I don't think that a clear approach has unfolded yet in terms of where this thing goes. It's interesting to me to see the level of defense military innovation funding that's actually in the state. But it's right now going into a series of different siloed programs, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Each of those is doing really valuable work. For example, there's a significant amount of it that actually funds Launch Alaska, and there's another portion of it that funds the Upstart Alpha Accelerator at CED. As two programs in particular, that are funded by the Office of Naval Research, in addition to Center ICE up there. And my own thought right now is, I think the way this could unfold is that there will need to be some sort of initial volunteer core group of people that are interested in this area of economic and community development, who will perhaps find the energy and the interest to meet and try and understand this landscape and the opportunities in order to develop some sort of plan of what could be done ahead that could lead to some funding. Ultimately, what I hope might happen is that if this innovation coalition turns into something that can generate some funding for innovation ecosystem building, that the military would become a focused area within that innovation coalition programming, and that it would have some support for communication and staffing and events to help do the boundary spanning work across that, and to help leverage some of the opportunity for the challenges that could be turned into startup and innovation opportunities. But that's just all kind of spitballing ultimately in terms of where I think we're at right now. It's gonna, like I said, I think it still starts with a core group of folks that want to work with this. I think Joe is interested in working on this. Dixie is. Graham is, I think, a valuable piece of this, but not able to put a lot of time into it. And potentially there's others that might be attracted into it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll keep kind of letting this bowl of jello jiggle a
I
little
wasn't
bit.
on the call.
Go ahead.
Kai, I wasn't on the call with the military folks last week, but how much discussion was there of kind of the need for security clearances and the potential to work with Church's new group on some of that?
That didn't come up at all in terms of security clearance requirements at this point. I did make contact with both of the groups last week at the what was it, Arctic Encounters or something, where the new Ted Stevens Arctic Security Group was there, as well as caught up with the folks with the with ADAC, and the new director there was Kerry, or I'm missing his name, I think. At any rate, so it's out there jiggling, but no, security didn't come up. Is that something you think is going to become a serious challenge for this issue?
We've been talking about this in the context of maritime domain awareness, and I'm a former security clearance holder, so I was privy to some discussions that were happening several years ago when my clearance was still active. I think there is going to be some fairly significant opportunities coming in the space that to operate in, you really need to be cleared to go have conversations with communications folks. And a lot of it just has to do with hardware. There's a lot of defense installations around Alaska that need to be updated. There are several programs that exist, mainly on the kind of maritime and airspace defense front, that just even begin to have a conversation about, what your client or potential customer wants. You're going to need to have some type of clearance, or at least be cleared to have conversations with folks at a lower level.
That's good to know. Thanks.
Yeah, and this is something I talked with Church and Craig about at Arctic Encounter, and I think there's some potential ways to work on this. We're certainly very interested in it. Getting a clearance is not a cheap or quick process, but it's something I think we could look at trying to figure out kind of some coordination methods on that I know have existed elsewhere. And certainly there are quite a few folks up here in that space who I think would be interested in these types of discussions.
Yeah, and Chris had security clearance. He could apply again for it. And then he was also in telecoms with the military and after. So sounds like a good fit.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what you need. The biggest challenge is getting someone to sponsor up here, especially at the higher levels, and to be all of government. You need someone at kind of churches level to be the primary clearance sponsor. The military itself typically doesn't have high enough clearance access for most of those programs. There's actually very few clearance holders in the state who can even have those discussions. And then the other is being able to access the facilities to actually go meet with. There's some certain restrictions there that you need to have clearance for.
Yeah.
Good to know. Okay, another piece of the puzzle that didn't come up last week. Thanks for raising the issue.
Yeah, and Kai, he has a TWIC card as well, which gives him access to ports and other places.
Okay.
Just for the notes, if that.
Ooh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's good to know.
How do you spell that? TWIC card?
TWIC.
TWIC. Oh, okay. Ah, my computer doesn't make capital C's. Okay, no problem. All right, good. Well, thanks for the update on that. I'll keep jiggling that and maybe have a little bit more next week at the board meeting in terms of part of the program discussion on that. And then again, next week is planned to be a board meeting. Next week's meeting is going to be primarily a businessy meeting. We have to approve an initial set of bylaws and articles of incorporation and just some minutia that's necessary to kind of launch things at this point and formally adopt the initial board of directors and terms and stuff like that. So we'll spend probably, I'm just spitballing here, probably half the meeting just dealing with some of the basic minutia of a first board meeting. And then from there, we can dive a little bit more into 2002 programming and some of the initial budget issues. So I hope it will be interesting, although this kind of board meeting is just administrative minutia that you have to do to kind of get to the better stuff later. I appreciate everybody who's interested and stepping up to be a part of that activity. Thank you.
Right, we only have an hour scheduled out. In my experience, something like this should probably be longer if people have time.
Good point. I'll look at putting out a note with, need to work with Ryan and get an agenda out, and we'll suggest to see if folks can stick around a little longer. On the other hand, I also know we've got some folks that can't attend next week, but we'll see if we can make a little more time so we're not cut short. You're right, hours, not much time, as is the case today.
Yeah, it'll be real tight. You know, we're trying to keep things within our standard meeting time just because it's hard to open up more for a lot of the folks. But I think if we keep it in the same window and we maybe nudge it a little bit longer in one direction or another, that could be a good way to fit in a little bit more. But I think that's a great point, Mita.
Cool. Well, in terms of today, I'm curious if folks had looked at that link that I sent and had some thoughts on this. I was super intrigued with Hegel's blog post, and for those of you that didn't read it, you know, I've been going through Hegel's newest book, The Journey Beyond Fear, which at first, you know, kind of came off as a self-help book, but in fact is turning out to be a super valuable approach at how to look at narratives and the power of those narratives with people who are engaged, and the creation of platforms for the work to be done that he develops in his book, that I think is a ideal roadmap for any of us that are building organizations to think through. And to just kind of summarize those three pieces, the narrative discussion that he opens up differentiates narratives from stories, and in particular identifies how narratives are really ways of explaining a path that is to be taken in a way that is designed to engage other people in supporting that narrative and its realization. And he differentiates narratives in, I believe, 4 different buckets. One is personal narratives or individual narratives that you or I might have about our own story or not necessarily a story, but actually our own narrative of what we're doing and where we're going. And then he talks about institutional narratives and how important they are for an organization to be able to share a narrative about their purpose, their why, if you're into Simon Sinek, but to more particularly expressed in a way that others want to be a part of it, that they want to join in that narrative. And he uses examples with some of the conservancy organizations. He uses Apple as another example that had a good narrative and in living differently. And the power of those narratives to engage the people and not just wanting your product or service, but wanting that broader narrative of what your organization is trying to achieve. And then he talks about geographic narratives, which are the ones that would be a regional type of a narrative, would be something, like our Alaska narrative that we're trying to construct about what we're trying to create as a next Alaska, and writing the narrative in a way that is an engaging way for people to say, I want to be a part of seeing that happen. And then finally, he talks about mission-oriented narratives that are around causes or some sort of mission is going on, whether it be a religious movement. Excuse me, that's now that I say that, that's what he calls them. He calls them movement narratives that are built around some movement, whether it's an energy transition, whether it's a conservation movement, and the importance of those narratives of engaging people. And so he develops this idea about narratives and their use as a way to express individual, organization, geographic, or movement in a way that helps people see where you're going, what you're trying to accomplish, but does it in a way that engages other people. And then he builds on that with the discussion about the importance of creating this opportunity mindset in yourself and in your organizations that shifts from being focused on the problems to the opportunities, and in that creating this passion of the explorer, which he develops as a thought on the importance of us seeking out with this degree of inquisitiveness and this exploration of being willing to look for what's out there that's unexpected, that's a little different than a laser focused mission, in the sense that this passion of the explorer is about engaging in these challenging, wicked, explorative type of activities, not necessarily knowing what you're going to find, and being open to the surprises of what will come along, and how important that mindset is to really being able to do the amazing work that could be done with this open-ended narrative. And his final piece in this structure is the importance of creating platforms. And platforms are not just a technological thing, but he develops the different kinds of platforms that exist, whether they're aggregation platforms of stuff like an eBay or an Amazon, or a societal or social platform like a Facebook or a LinkedIn, and platforms that are organizational in terms of just resources. And he then posits that the future will be driven by the creation of something he says doesn't exist yet, which is the development of learning platforms that allow people to come together to accelerate their learning and to draw on the resources they need to take the next steps that they're trying to achieve. So you can imagine that all of that got me super excited in terms of this next Alaska work that we're doing in Alaska version 3. And then finally was his post that I saw that suggested that rather than our present creating our future, he suggested that our future, in fact, creates our present. And what he's suggesting in that is that our view of the manifest future that we see for ourselves actually changes our present. It changes ourself, it changes our organizations, it changes how we work, what we work on, and the energy that we put into it. And so I was super curious about all that. I hope I didn't take too much time in summarizing for those of you that didn't read this blog or were interested in it, but I'm curious about other thoughts that people have about this and how it resonated or didn't with you.
Guy, I haven't read it yet. I mean, I'm just now getting into some of the background there, but it does resonate with, so many things that I started looking back at. We got into the strategic doing yesterday, which was really great. I appreciate that. And thinking about the iterations, the strategic planning and visioning. And I know my work at the National Training Laboratory, and I was trained by Ron Lippitt, who is one of the founders, and his whole philosophy around futuring, preferred futuring. And it seems like we keep ramping up to a more effective and better and inclusive and deeper ability or capacities to bring in like my OD background, bring in the whole room, make sure that everybody's there that needs to be there or should be there. And it's exciting stuff. There are a lot of moving parts, and I'm curious of getting into Hegel's stuff. This whole thing about beyond fear. What's that old acronym? False expectations appearing real is the acronym for fear. And how many false expectations or things that keep us from, jumping into the next thing. And yeah, that's a big thing to overcome. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting more into that. So I thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know for me, this concept that he's laying out is really inspiring. And it seems like, maybe a sketch or the beginnings of a framework for ways to help support a bunch of people. When we look at the funding that's going to be coming through for the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and Build Back Better, there's going to be a whole lot of work that needs to be done really quickly, and a whole lot of people that are going to need to be able to rapidly get skills, and a whole lot of needs assessments and asset mapping that's going to need to happen. And when you're talking on that sort of scale to be able to respond appropriately, you really do need a platform or some sort of like overarching support for folks to be able to come together and to work together. And so it's really exciting. I think I'm finding myself almost becoming like a little bit impatient. I'm like, okay, well, I know that we need this, and so like let's do this now. And so I have just been kind of trying to wonder, like, how do you actually implement something like this? How do you start to come at it? Because it really it takes so many people working together. And it's almost less about the idea itself, but more about the people that you can get in the room to work on the thing. Because, you can have somebody like, for me, if Mark Zuckerberg came and said, hey, look, I've got the funding, I can make this happen, I'll solve all of your problems, I would say, that's great, I'm not interested. But, if there was somebody else, if, members in this room came together and said, all right, well, let's build this thing, I said, great, let me know how I can help. What do we need to do? What are the first steps? How do we do this? And I almost wonder if there's a bit of asset mapping that could happen, at a smaller level, just to say, well, maybe I don't have, maybe I don't have the $10 million that it would take to implement a system like this, but man, I've got some free time. I've got this skill, I've got that skill, I've got this space that we could get together and we could start to make something like this happen. And I think what you would find is if you were to start down this pathway, you would very rapidly have a bunch of aligned interests and a bunch of other opportunities that would come out of it. but I think becoming very clear on the narrative for why we would be doing this and why we would need this is pretty key and core, but also pretty low capital intense. It doesn't take a whole lot of money to come up with an idea or to have conversations with folks. So, that could be a more approachable way to get things started.
I want to jump in. I left some notes in some things in the chat area. At noon today, former Ambassador Kenneth, or I think he's still current ambassador, and I think was the Secretary of Navy, is the title of the Alaska World Affairs Council virtual meeting is the War on Ukraine, Changing the Shape of Arctic Security. And so that there's a link in the chat where you can actually go in and register. So just wanted to give everybody a heads up on that.
Thanks. Well, any other thoughts on this narrative issue and where we might go with this? I am drawn to a couple thoughts. One is I think it presents some foundations for us to work on down the road in terms of the structure of the organization and some of the outcomes we work for. I'm also reminded of some of the discussions at the infrastructure symposium that was going on last week, that there's this growing awareness, but lack of a path forward, that this bill and all the projects, as Ryan was mentioning, have this opportunity to be transformative for the state. But if we don't have some sort of structure under which to enable that transformation, we will have simply done a bunch of work. But once it's all done, we will be, exhausted and fragmented, and maybe not any better for having done it, as we found ourselves after the pipeline era, when we were all putting bumper stickers on the cars saying, God, give me one more pipeline. I promise not to mess it up again this time. And I think there's an urgent need now for us to create this narrative, to create this future, because if we don't create this future, the present that we're going to have is going to be left to fragmented bits and pieces. And there'll be lots of good bits and pieces that'll be done. There's no question that the investments in the infrastructure projects will all be good where they're put in place, but we will have lost the significance of the opportunity. And somehow we have to figure out how to create that path to be able to build that narrative and to be able to put it into a place that has a level of interest and engagement from others, that it can begin influencing how people look at the present by helping define that future outcome that we want to see from all these projects. And I don't know how to do that. I just think that the opportunity is there, and Hegel's writing kind of shows the value of trying to do that, but leaves it as a bit of magic in terms of how to make it happen.
I haven't read the blog or the book yet, but it sounds relevant to some of our traditional teachings, because that connection to ancestors is transcendent of time and physicality, and like the concept of 7 generations is that your behavior should be informed in the reality that you want those 7 generations to live in. So, and there's some kind of intuitive work or ceremonial work that also behaves on some of those same premise. So I'm interested to look at the book. I don't have any feedback on the blog itself at this time, but from what I'm hearing from this group discussion and what you're saying, Kai, is it seems to follow some of the rules of engagement with creating reality.
Is there any approach that you can draw on from that traditional body of knowledge about how we would engage in creating that clarity of those 7 generations, or that perspective of the 7 generations?
Yeah, so I mean, we start walking into the metaphysics realm in this conversation where basically it's like a thought experiment where you would sit and meditate and just allow the imagination. You give a few parameters, there's actually, I just listened to this guy. I was in maybe I said this last week, but I was speaking at a Stanford University class, and it was engineering and climate change and entrepreneurship. And they had a gentleman who was a utopian sci-fi writer, and he calls it the Ministry of the Future. So that area of creativity and subconscious is, if you think about it, it's not individual and disconnected. It's actually a place where a lot of people delve down into, and that's how Jungian psychology gets the archetypes, because they are relatable to many different people. So the mechanics of it would be giving yourself a few parameters, like we want to imagine what it's going to be like in 7 generations, right? And we want to imagine that we're going to be successful, and then start creating that internal narrative of what did we do to be successful, right? Instead of looking at all the barriers that we have now, imagine success and then work backwards. So it's like you're doing like the little timeline or spider webs backwards to see how we got to that point.
This is really valuable, and it also reminds me of some of the work we were looking at with Adam Kahani with transformative scenario planning, and that process of engaging communities and trying to imagine those future scenarios and using that as a framing to create that future perspective that you could then work towards and creating the work to be done now. And it'd be interesting to develop that a little bit further, because I still think that ability to create that clarity, whether it's in a 7 generations format or the TSP, is a necessary first step for us.
Yeah, and it's a funny process because it starts to tap into our creative aspect, but then once you get into those creative and that kind of collective group consciousness, you start tapping into an intuitive base. So your future self starts to help inform your current self and successful in that timeline.
Can you say that again? I was intrigued with what you just said. Your future self starts to.
Right. So because time in its linear sense is very, like, it's something that we've created. But when you start getting into the way that cycles behave and you get into that liminal creative space, then your future self starts to inform your present self. And you start tapping in. If you can get into that trained meditation and into that creative space, you can start actually leveraging and working an intuitive arm.
Fascinating.
Telling you all my secrets, Kai.
You continue to amaze me with the wealth of resources and knowledge that you've built up. And I'm so thankful we have a chance to tap into that.
Well, I'll tell you guys a secret. So some of my chops on the work that I do was as a working intuitive counselor for many years. So having complete strangers come in and plop down in front of me and asking me to like questions and all sorts of stuff. So
it's fascinating work. Good. Well, I look forward to learning more about it. Any other thoughts from folks as I watch the clock ticking that you'd like to share in this regard, or what next steps we might take that are interesting to you in this?
Apologies for not being more involved. I was on this other call, but I've been trying to listen in. One book I would highly recommend to folks, if you haven't picked it up already, is Power Law by Sebastian Mallaby. Really good history on venture capital and tech in the United States, and lots of interesting things to ponder when it comes to ecosystem development in the stories he tells. So kind of a dense read, small font, but I've been kind of working my way through it the last few weeks, and it's pretty good.
Good, thanks for Taylor.
Taylor, can you say that again? I didn't catch it.
Yeah, it's Power Law, the Power Law, by Sebastian Malaby. It just came out last month.
How do you spell his last name?
Malaby, I think it's Mallaby.
Thank you.
He's very British.
That's
Quite.
good. Thanks, Taylor. Good. Well, thank you all for that. We've got the World Affairs Council meeting that Dick had shared that's going on, I guess, today at noon. So that'd be an hour from now, I think. I've lost track of which time zone I'm in. Any other announcements or anything anyone wants to share as we wrap up? Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for joining the